actually from Germany, but initially from St. Petersburg, Ivan Sablin, Ivan Valerievich Sablin, officially. I assume you all know Ivan right now. He's here for how long now? For more than 3 months, or almost for 3 months. As said, he works in Germany, in Heidelberg. He has an ERC, European Research Council project, where he leads also the research group engaged in this project called Entangled Parliamentarism, Constitutional Practices in Russia, Ukraine, China, and Mongolia from 1905 to 2005. So the whole 20th century in a period as wider as the whole of the Europe. Of course, his research interests includes, logically, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire, with special focus on Russian Far East. His, I think, first 2 monographs were devoted to Russian Far East, governing post-imperial Siberia and Mongolia, 1911-1924, and the rise and fall of Russia's Far Eastern Republic, 1905-1922, both published by Routledge. He currently works on 2 other monographs. The first one devoted to conceptual and institutional history of parliaments in Russia and in Soviet Union, from the first State Duma to up until 1991. And the second one focused on, let's say, comparative history of post-socialist parliament. But the second one is really work in progress, together with colleagues from Prague and Ljubljana. And may I introduce only his last edited volume, Parties as Governments in Eurasia, 1913-1991, Nationalism, Socialism and Development. I assume that part of it will be presented in today's Ivan's lecture Apes book later on. So Ivan, it's a real pleasure to have you here. I'm sure that our mutual cooperation will broaden and deepen in the future. So please, the floor is yours. How much time does he have, Marko?
45 minutes.
Okay, let's make it 40.
Depends,
Okay.
It depends if there will be enough public. Maybe we could stay here whole day. I'm having fun. Okay. I'm sure that he will. He can. It's not just 20 minutes presentation. It's a lecture.
Okay, sounds good.
We can stay here for the whole day.
Thank you very
Ivan,
much.
the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's my pleasure to present this topic today because this is part of a larger cooperative project. You mentioned already that I'm working together with colleagues from Prague and Ljubljana. Actually, I'm working together with Yuri on this monograph and Adela Gurichova from Prague. So I will be presenting part dealing with the Soviet Union. And as you can see, the key issue that I want to discuss today are the functions of Supreme Soviet. So let's get the most basic things out of the way very quickly. According to the constitution, the Supreme Soviet was the supreme body of state power. So it wasn't called a parliament in any legal documents, but it was called parliament colloquially. And it was referred to parliament also by international observers, and a group from the Supreme Soviet actually included all deputies, as you can see, 1,500 deputies as of 1974. They were all members of the parliamentary group of the Soviet Union in the Inter-Parliamentary Union. So it was there on the map of global parliaments, but it was not a parliament in any normative liberal democratic sense, because the elections were uncontested, so one candidate for one seat. I will show you the ballot. It looks amazing. We will take a closer look at it until 1988. Then you can see that the size of this assembly was huge, especially before perestroika reforms, but the meetings were very short. So usually it met once or twice a year for just a couple of days. This means that most of the work was done by the standing Presidium, which is relatively sizable group in itself, comparable to senates in other countries. But I will address these issues too in the talk. So basically, what we have to get out of the way first, it was not a parliament in the normative sense, so it was not a deliberative institution. There was no possibility to discuss anything. It was not an institution of dissensus. Everything, apart from one procedural matter at the very first meeting in 38, was adopted unanimously. And that procedural matter, if you are wondering, regarded the time when the second chamber, the Council of Nationalities, would end its meeting so that deputies can go to theaters and museums. That was the only discussion that was there over the entire period before perestroika. It also had no control over the Council of Ministers, so no sovereignty within the system either. So in that regard, if we follow Pasi Ihalainen's and Kari Palanen's definition of parliaments, it was not a parliament at all, even in the remotest sense. But as it was there, as it was quite a sizable and a costly body, you can imagine that also for organizing the elections, the government spent a lot of money for having these over 1,000 deputies travel back and forth. Government spent a lot of money. We have to address its functions. There has been relatively scarce historical research on state socialist parliaments. The only recent publication that is relevant in this regard is Adela Guruchova's chapter devoted to the state socialist parliament in Czechoslovakia. So historians rarely deal with these institutions in detail, precisely because they were not parliaments in the normative sense. Political scientists, however, spend a lot of attention to this, spend a lot of time paying attention to the Supreme Soviet because they try to figure out why we have this institution in the first place. So I'm actually following their work a lot in this regard, and especially the work of Daniel Nelson and Stephen White, published in '82, is important because they were the first to actually outline some of the key functions of state socialist legislatures, going beyond the idea they're just mere rubber stamps. So if we were to briefly outline the main functions of the Supreme Soviet, and by extension most other state socialist parliaments, we can group them into three categories. So symbolic functions, I'll give you examples, then some actual domestic functions. By actual here, I mean functions going beyond pure symbolism. So the people who were part of the Supreme Soviet and the Supreme Soviet, they were actually doing something, right? Not just sitting there and approving everything. And it also had some international functions. So one of the reasons I started this talk with 1955 is because in 1955, the Supreme Soviet acquired a number of international functions after joining the Inter-Parliamentary Union, right? That was 1955. So let's start with symbolic functions. One of the key functions there was a ritual function of loyalty. And every citizen of the Soviet Union had to participate in that. So the local party organizations had to reach 100% turnout at the elections. And of course, if somebody did not participate in the elections, there could be reprimands at work, problems elsewhere. So it was, in a way, a forced affair, right? Everyone had to go and participate in the elections. I would say to give their vote, but in a few moments you will see why this is not the case. I would say participate, to come to the polling station. So we can see here two examples of propaganda, and the figures are approving something. So this is a very common type of pictures that we see from the Supreme Soviet when everyone is approving whatever is told to them. So this picture here, you can see that the setup of the chamber is very much like that of a classroom rather than a parliament. There are no sectors. There is no opposition like in the British Parliament, right? There is the Presidium, where there are a lot of party leaders who are actual leaders of the country, and there is the mass, who has to sit there, listen, and approve everything which is told to them. And by extension, the elections, you can see in this poster, they're very much connected to this. So the approval starts at the very basic level with every citizen over the age of 18. So the elections were a ritual, as I mentioned, right? It was solemn affair. So you would have young pioneers, especially during the later period, present there next to the ballot boxes. You would have also images of Lenin before 1953. Actually, before 1956, you would have pictures of Stalin everywhere too. But what's quite interesting here, you can already notice on this picture that nobody folds the ballot. And there is no booth, right? So there is a booth technically where you can go in and do whatever you want to do there. But then you go out and you kind of openly show what's on your ballot, right? It was also a festival. So it wasn't, a boring kind of ritual. It was a festival with dance, with food, with candy. And some of the complaints during the discussion of the 77 constitution, the Brezhnev constitution, was precisely about the lack of candy and sweets on election day in some areas of the Soviet Union. That was trouble, right? So, for example, here we can see artists who were touring polling stations in Georgia and entertaining the voters. So the voters would usually go there with their families, and some of the memoirs of Soviet citizens would say that I participated in Soviet elections when I was 3 months old, and then show pictures when they are there together with their parents, dropping the ballot in the booth. There was no escape from Soviet elections. Even if you were somewhere very far in tundra, you would still have a helicopter bring you the ballot box and the ballots so that you could vote. I mean, this picture is not from the Supreme Soviet of the USSR elections, but from the Russian Federation within the USSR, but the principle is the same. Also, you can see that here, nowhere a booth is to be found. So if you are making something with the ballot, you have to make it openly, and I mean, yeah, you put it here under the supervision of whoever came by helicopter to you. The ballot. So I intrigued you a little bit with the ballot, so let's see the ballot. I find this ballot actually was stolen from the polling station during the 1974 elections, and it ended up at a museum. There is some basic information here about what type of election, Supreme Soviet, the date, the electoral district. This is the most interesting part here. Please leave in the ballot the last name of one candidate which you support, and cross every other candidate out. But this is it. There is no second page to this ballot. So every ballot for every Supreme Soviet elections on both the Union level and the Republican level looked exactly like this. You would have one candidate, and then there are organizations or meetings that nominating this candidate. Which means, why would you use a booth? Only to cross out the only candidate who is nominated, actually appointed by the party. Which means you are a threat to the Soviet state because you don't trust the decisions of the party. Which means that if you go to a booth, you automatically alert the people dressed in civic clothes there who work for KGB. There are jokes, of course, a lot of jokes about Soviet elections created already in the 30s when these type of elections were first introduced. For example, a man comes to the elections and there is a very kind of seriously looking man in civic clothes meeting him. So he takes the ballot and he takes a look at it, and the man in civic clothes asks, "What are you doing?" And he's saying, "I want to look at the ballot." And he says, "Don't you know that the elections have secret ballot?" So there were also some urban legends about invisible ink and people being traced. And some of them were, of course, grounded because if you didn't kind of follow the standard way, so come, take the ballot, and preferably without folding it, just put it into the ballot box, then you might get in trouble. So the ritual continued in the Supreme Soviet itself, right? I told you that this is a very common type of picture from the Supreme Soviet. The involvement of Soviet citizens also didn't stop with the elections themselves. It also started before. It started with a campaign. So the candidates who were nominated by the party, who were appointed by the party, they were formally nominated. Then they would be traveling around their district, giving speeches, mainly outlining their party's main ideas. Some of them were not necessarily members of the party. Actually, around 20% was the quota for non-party members, but all of them ran as part of the so-called forced coalition or permanent coalition, the so-called the coalition of communists and non-party members. So every single candidate was from that coalition. Also, as a voter, as a constituent, your involvement didn't stop after you voted, because you had to participate at your place of work at rallies like this one, welcoming, for example, the opening of the 7th session of the Supreme Soviet. This was the session where Brezhnev's constitution was adopted. So that symbolic function, I hope, is clear. Basically, a ritual, complex and multi-stage ritual of expressing total loyalty and total cohesion to the party. One very famous Soviet writer, Mikhail Prishvin, wrote in his diary on the day of the elections in 1940s that he understood the sense of the Soviet elections finally. That was abandoning own subjectivity. So by coming there to the polling station and doing what the party wants you to do, basically every Soviet citizen abandoned their own subjectivity, ceding it to the party, because everybody understood the system and everybody did that anyway. There were other functions related to this symbolic realm. One of the most important one was that of descriptive representation. So many deputies in the parliament were not representing themselves, so to say. There were, of course, famous people in the parliament, but there were very many so-called common workers and collective farmers, or previously peasants, right? So they were there to represent a particular social group. They were there, for example, to represent particular ethnicity. So this poster for the Supreme Soviet elections in Azerbaijan states that the voters in that Union Republic were expected to select the best, to elect the best worthy sons and daughters of their people, meaning the Azerbaijani people. But actually, it could mean also the broader Soviet people, but the picture here shows Azerbaijanis, right? Then a very, very widespread genre are the pictures of deputies at their place of work. Of course, I mentioned to you that they are in the Supreme Soviet for just a couple of days a year. Of course, they are at their workplace most of the time. And I told you that they did not represent themselves as persons. So there is very little information on these people as individuals, even in the archive, because they actually didn't participate in the legislation at all, in any way. Even they didn't participate in commissions or anything, so their role was to represent a particular social group. Apart from ethnicity, they would represent, for example, their class, so workers or peasants, collective farmers. They would represent their gender, they would represent their age group, they would represent their region. So every person in the Supreme Soviet who was not part of the party bureaucracy, because those were also part of the Supreme Soviet, they would be kind of the average person from, okay, not average, of course, the best person from that particular social group. Then the Supreme Soviet also had this function, which is somewhere between symbolic and already practical, of recognition of individuals. So there were many famous deputies in the Supreme Soviet, including, for example, the first woman who went to outer space, Valentina Tereshkova. And Valentina Tereshkova has been in parliament far longer than she was involved in the space program. And she's actually the longest serving Russian parliamentarian and Soviet parliamentarian, because she started her career in 1960s and then she continued. I don't recall if she's still there in the Duma, but she was there just a few years ago, and now she's supporting the official agenda of the ruling party, but basically doing the same thing she has been doing since the 60s. So this recognition of outstanding individuals also was quite important. There were certainly jokes about that in the Soviet Union as well. There were some very basic perks coming with the job. For example, free trips on public transportation. So, I mean, if the party nominated you locally for a deputy position, you might as well do it, because you get, for example, free travel out of it. And you can get also some allowance, depending where you are and what level of the Supreme Soviet. You might also get a car, so it's actually not bad. And you also get once or twice a year a trip to Moscow, where you can buy stuff for your family and friends. Another symbolic function was that of integration. So basically all these different people coming together into one monolithic Soviet community. So it was monolithic, of course, for the, let's say, rank and file deputies and by definition citizens, and it was hierarchical in relation to the party. Here you can see that there were also festive, solemn sessions in which Soviet Union was part. So in 77 came a relatively interesting change. So Brezhnev for the first time combined the presidency of the Supreme Soviet Presidium and that of leadership in the party. So basically the two bodies came together. So gatherings like these, they're quite common already during this period where you have the central committee of the party and you also have the Supreme Soviet. And also as under Brezhnev, just like under Stalin, we have very asymmetric relations between different national groups within the Soviet Union with their preference towards Russians and a new wave of Russification. You would have the Russian parliament there. So their confluence is quite interesting. But at the same time, the idea was integration of them all into one Soviet community in loyalty to the party and by definition to ideology, right? And there is one art project that I hope somebody will do. That's the increase of the size of Lenin at this meeting, because at some point I think the statue goes like this in already during perestroika. If we look at the symbolism internationally, the Supreme Soviet was a major example for both dependent state socialist regimes, those which depended on the Soviet Union in concrete terms. They were either hosting Soviet military or advisors or both, or they were dependent in pragmatic and ideological sense. Like, for example, China under Stalin, before the Sino-Soviet split, followed the advice of the Soviet Union, despite the absence of Soviet troops there, just because of this idea of common ideology and seniority of Stalin. They didn't do it after his death, right? So, for example, all across the globe, on almost every continent, you would have a parliament which would be very similar to the Supreme Soviet, because this was part of the structural adjustments within the broader Soviet Empire. For example, here we have the Cuban parliament, the National Assembly of People's Power, right? And we have Fidel Castro here sitting in the front row, but the operation would be very similar. So unanimous votes, unanimous turnout at the elections, unanimous support for the ruling party, and so on. Also, the Supreme Soviet was there to symbolize what it was not, and it was not a bourgeois parliament, right? So I wouldn't say this is deception here. Definitely, the Supreme Soviet didn't have these categories and points of criticism that were attached to a bourgeois parliament, right? So, okay, this was very similar, okay, but these two categories, right, there were no qualifications. On the contrary, everybody had to participate. That was mandatory in a way. There was not so much buying of votes, because you actually don't have any competitive elections. I don't know about nomination. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to those type of files. If you could buy yourself into being appointed by the party, that is quite possible, but not on the level of voters and elections themselves. This, of course, was quite similar, the deception part, and the speeches about peace and freedom were part of the Soviet Union, Supreme Soviet, because it was also an amplifier for propaganda. So that's the last symbolic function that I want to mention, is that people came there, the deputies, to repeat what the party leaders were saying. They were until 87, there were no independent speeches in the Supreme Soviet. For worker and collective farmer deputies, the speeches were written by the Central Committee bureaucracy. That actually, we can see some complaints in the memoirs, in the late memoirs of the bureaucrats working for the Central Committee of how many speeches they have to prepare, and lamenting in their diaries, saying that 2 o'clock, I have to come up with a speech delivered by some collective farmer or worker. I don't care yet. I don't know yet who's going to be delivered by, but I already know what's going to be in there. Big question, did the Soviet citizens buy that? Not really, right? So this is an opinion of one of these bureaucrats, Andrei Chernaev, who was an AD of one of the prominent participants of the Supreme Soviet and one of the party leaders, Boris Ponomarev, and who was actually doing all this type of job, writing speeches, and as you will see later, also preparing for international exchanges. So he here comments, for example, on the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, which is supposed to be actually the decision-making body, that it's also a performance and nobody is buying it. There is some, here he's, of course, talking about the impotence of the main character of Brezhnev, right? That he's just reading there very awkwardly some stuff and everybody approves it and people see that on TV and nobody cares, right? Now, let's come to the functions that were beyond the symbolic realm. So something that happened behind the curtains. The Supreme Soviet had commissions and committees. Committees were introduced during perestroika, but commissions were there in each chamber, and their meetings were not open to public. So some scholars in the West, some political scientists, they hypothesized that, for example, the increase in the number of these committees meant that they did something. So that sounds right, but unfortunately it was wrong. So these committees did not deliberate any matters. So these committees served as micro-amplifiers of the official ideology. So the leaders of these committees were simultaneously leaders of the party, so they were there, and they would inform whoever was to be informed on the most recent developments and plans. So in the committees, you would do the same as you did in the plenary. You would go there, you would sit, listen to what's told to you, and then pass it on, to your constituents. Mainly to the bureaucracy on your level. So, for example, here the joint meeting of 2 commissions of the 2 chambers, under Gorbachev and Boris Ponomarev, that's the boss of Chernaev, whose memoirs were quite important for me. They're informing, well, not rank and file deputies, so relatively important deputies on the main developments in international affairs. In 1955, I mentioned the group of the Supreme Soviet joined the IPU, the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Earlier that year, in February 1955, the Supreme Soviet adopted unanimously, if you are surprised to hear that, unanimously adopted a declaration, an appeal to all parliaments of the world, suggesting to exchange in parliamentary delegations. And starting in 1955, that became one of the main functions of the Supreme Soviet. So I will come to that in a few moments, but as not the body as a whole, but for individual deputies, there was a very important domestic function as well. And that function was that of a feedback mechanism. So each deputy was not a representative of the populace, because each deputy was appointed by the party, but each deputy in that capacity was a representative of the party and the state. So basically, each deputy was the contact person, the tech support, customer service for any Soviet citizen in that constituency. And a lot of famous deputies who were elected to the Supreme Soviet were very unpleasantly surprised by that, because they would start receiving hundreds or thousands of letters and telegrams every month, and they had to address these concerns, summarize them, and pass them to their respective authority further. This was a practice that started already before the introduction of the Supreme Soviet, and just to give you some numbers, the Presidium of the previous Supreme Soviet body, the Central Executive Committee, which is basically the same thing, said in late 1937 that they have some 150,000 accumulated appeals over the past 2 months, which have not been addressed yet. And then in the Stalinist terms, they give a sacred oath to as they say, to clear out the mountains of the undiscussed appeals. So you can see here, Ilya Ehrenburg, a famous writer and journalist, says that the main task of a Soviet deputy was that of being a lawyer, an intercessor, and a pusher. Type of questions were related to every sphere of Soviet life. No good living conditions. Medical personnel was rude to me when I went there. I didn't get into the university, but I was supposed to. My husband needs a new job. Every type of matters. Also, during the previous period when there were mass-scale repressions, people would raise that issue as well. There was a standard, also pre-typed reply from the Presidium on some matters that weren't taken up when Kalinin was still heading the Supreme Soviet Presidium until 1946, that said, unfortunately, Kalinin can do nothing about your affair. It was pre-typed and then just signed by Kalinin and sent back. But during the later Soviet period, these appeals and petitions, they served as a mass source for fine-tuning of official policy. So they were collected, organized statistically, and then submitted to whoever had both positions of power within the system of the Supreme Soviet and the party. So Brezhnev, for example, before coming to power in the party, was in that position in the Supreme Soviet. So here we can see a summary of petitions and other information which was submitted to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet on drug use. So that was in a situation when there is no freedom of press, no freedom of expression. That was a very important feedback mechanism which allowed the elites to see what people were actually concerned about. There are cases, for example, when some 150,000 petitions on medical matters alone are analyzed during the later period. And then there is information prepared for the Central Committee stating that, well, you can see from these petitions that Soviet healthcare has been improving, but there are a few issues, such as, and then there is a list for 2 pages of the issues. You know, as I mentioned, rude nurses, lack of spaces for bedding, lack of heating and hot water, lack of medicine, incorrect diagnosis, and so on and so on and so on. And then from there, of course, there was specific information delivered about where the problems were exactly. Another quite interesting domestic function, not of the Supreme Soviet as a whole, but of its Presidium, was the issue of pardons. And that actually, when I started working on this topic, seemed to me just one of those symbolic things, because I thought that everything related to pardons was adopted by the party leadership, but it turned out not to be true. So here we have a picture with the most corrupt, as documented, official in Soviet history. So that's Yagdarna Sredinova, who at this time was chairwoman of the Council of Nationalities of the Supreme Soviet, but before she was the head of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Uzbek Republic. So according to party documents and memoirs, she earned hundreds of millions of rubles through one scheme that she has been practicing in Uzbekistan. So her co-conspirators would issue death sentences to people in Uzbekistan for matters, for crimes, actually committed crimes in most cases, which did not demand death sentence. Then she, as the head of the Presidium, would issue a pardon in exchange for a bribe. And through that scheme, she earned a lot of money. And there was no official investigation on the part of security services. There was an inner-party investigation. So she was reprimanded and demoted to, I think, the head of the Committee on the Relations with Asia and Africa, and, you know, maybe deputy minister in a smaller ministry of the union level, right? But she was, for perestroika time, when kind of things like that came to light, she was the figure of the corrupt Soviet politician. I already mentioned that the Supreme Soviet started also to have very important international functions. And in 1955 onwards, it sent out and received hundreds of delegations, big and small, to every possible corner of the world, and then the delegations which came, sometimes simultaneously, to the USSR would also travel the country, go to different Union republics, visit different cities, and so on. So here we can see the official version of that presented by one of the deputies at the plenary. This is very accurately, despite it being kind of said in the controlled propaganda setting. So there were three types of exchanges. One of them related to state socialist countries. I would add, another sub-level here, because when it pertains to dependent contexts, for example, Czechoslovakia or Poland or Mongolia, it was an instrument of cohesion. So basically, the Supreme Soviet delegation was something like a revision committee, which would come there and check if everything was all right, if, go there, sit in their parliament, see if everybody was voting unanimously, if there was no deviation, from the model, and so on. They would also travel to factories, see if the construction of socialism is going the right way. And delegations like that would be greeted, for example, in Prague, with slogans like "friendship for eternity" with the Soviet Union, right? It sounds very kind of doom and gloomy if you think about it, right? But this friendship for eternity was there for a visit like that. Sub-level, which was not pronounced here, related to Yugoslavia. So the state socialist contexts, which were not part of the Soviet informal empire. There was an element of competition. So the visits of delegations were organized in a very similar manner in Yugoslavia and in Soviet Union. You would take the delegations, you would exhaust them, you would take them everywhere. So the Soviet delegation would be taken to every republic, every type of institution. So the list itself of institutions which they visited, types of institutions, I think is an entire paragraph. Kindergartens, hospitals, factories, mines, transport centers, and so on and so on and so on, everywhere. And then, of course, the takeaway out of it was, can we convince our fellow state socialist builders that we are also doing something there? And then, the Supreme Soviet deputies had to admit begrudgingly that, we, after the visit, saw that Yugoslavia also achieved some success in building socialism, although they're doing it their own way, but they did achieve something. I don't know what the Yugoslav parliamentarians thought about that after visiting Soviet Union, but hopefully we'll find some material on that. The second major category of visits was to the capitalist countries. So I will show you a couple of examples. In some cases, they were predominantly supposed to show the human face of the Soviet Union and state socialism, and to gain some, let's say, passive supporters in foreign parliaments, right? To show that, okay, people live the same way you live over there. We also have some interesting, nice nature and culture here, and we're doing something good for the people. So you don't have to support us, but maybe when you go back there, you won't demonize us anymore. Also, at later stages, especially in the relations with the US, they involved some real negotiations, right? So party leaders would be included in these Supreme Soviet delegations. Of course, no ordinary deputy worker or dairymaid would be allowed to actually participate in these negotiations, but party members who tagged along. Of course, during the later period, that was also a nice thing to get on a trip to the US, for example, smuggle some jeans back, I don't know. And then they would actually discuss something. And then the third category was that of exchanges with post-colonial contexts. So basically, mainly members of the non-alignment movement. So countries in Asia and Africa, for them, coming to the USSR was supposed to demonstrate the advantages of Soviet modernization. So they would be taken to factories, and then on exchange visits, they would be offered also concrete financial help, right? Again, by the party leaders who are part of this delegation. So just to illustrate these types of exchanges, again, exchange of the first type with other state socialist countries, that's before the Sino-Soviet split. For example, the Chinese parliamentary delegation was taken to the subway in Leningrad to show kind of how this infrastructural project worked. And later stages, I noticed that these exchanges became some kind of a routine, bureaucratic routine. I guess it was also symbolic for the domestic leaders. For example, here is a very, not such festive kind of journalistic photo anymore. Very, very kind of common day with not very nicely decorated place in the airport where just the flags are in the background, and you can see also that it's either the secret diplomatic correspondence or I don't know, could be caviar, because there's some delegations too that are also with them. But this is delegation from the People's Council of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which was modeled after the Supreme Soviet. And then sometimes there were multiple delegations coming together for a meeting of the Supreme Soviet, which would have to take place in a sporting venue because there were so many people, right? The deputies alone, that's already a lot. And then you have all this delegation from dependent regimes. That was the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. China was still around. I don't know if the Yugoslav delegation was present there as guests because the relations were already more or less okay at the time. But this was also performance of loyalty on behalf of dependent state socialist leaders, because they would sit there just like Soviet deputies and listen to whatever at this time Khrushchev would tell them. And then they would return the favor by repeating the same points in their own speeches. The more interesting type of exchanges is the one with post-colonial countries, which would be taken to all type of institutions. I will have three examples here. Ideology, to show, you know, the founder of the state. So they would be taken to Lenin's museum, to some other places related to Lenin. For example, here we have Ceylonese delegation. Then to medical and research institution. So here we have Colombian delegation in the Center for Children's and Perinatal Medicine, right? Then you would have people attending universities, laboratories, factories, as I mentioned, right? And then this was not just for show, right? There could be some concrete agreements made after that the Soviet Union will provide medical advisors, that the Soviet Union will provide this type of financial aid in exchange for loyalty in the ideological sense, or at least, you know, vocal support of some of the matters important for the Soviet Union. It was also supposed to show the inclusiveness of the Soviet Union, because one of the destinations for these delegations were the religious institutions, which were reestablished in 1940s and became part of this foreign image construction in the Soviet Union. So, for example, they took the Ceylonese parliamentary delegation to visit a mosque in Tashkent to show that socialism doesn't have to be exclusive of religious diversity. I don't know why they didn't take them to Ulan-Ude to visit a Buddhist monastery, because the Ceylonese delegation most likely consisted only of Buddhists, but other type of delegation did go to Ulan-Ude and visit this officially recognized and sanctioned religious institution. I wouldn't go as far as, you know, calling them the religious Disneyland, but it was a little bit like that, right? You know, with the Buddhist institution, then there was some kind of tests involved. So the Buddhist monks from abroad would ask Soviet Buddhist monks to, for example, what are the three jewels of Buddhism? And then if they respond yes, that means that Soviet Union has freedom of religion. So it was also tourism for Soviet leaders. So here we have Brezhnev enjoying himself in India in 61, but at the same year he also went to Sudan, where a memorandum was signed together with the Sudanese leader at the time by Brezhnev. So not by the party leader, but by the formal Supreme Soviet president at the time. So Brezhnev didn't come to power until 64 in the real sense, right? He was this figurehead of the parliament, but he still had some competence to sign agreement about financial aid to Sudan and development. So it had some matters like that. With Western countries, as I said, it was predominantly tourism. So here we have French parliamentarians in Kiev. Then we have Russian Soviet parliamentarians in Disneyland. So I keep including this picture in every presentation I make on the Supreme Soviet, even if it's not entirely relevant for the topic, that I will fight for including it into both of the books. Yes, so I think this is very illustrative of the exchanges, at least for part of the delegation, which was not there as representatives of the party, which was there to show that, you know, workers and peasants are actually there in the Supreme Soviet. But then I mentioned that in the relations with the US, there were some real talks involved in this event. So, for example, here we see Joseph Biden in the Soviet Union as part of the US Congress delegation in '79. Just to give you a glimpse of the inner machinery of these visits. That was a nightmare for the poor bureaucrats in the Central Committee. Why? If you ever played an RPG video game with a lot of branching dialogues, you know, you can see that there is a lot of labor involved in development. I mean, in better games, surely in worse games, you can see that there is lack of labor. But in any case, you have to come up with a dialogue tree. You know, response A, response B, and the branching responses go in there. You know, the dialogue tree. This is exactly what the bureaucrats in the Central Committee had to do for the rank and file deputies. Why? Because they needed to predict every possible development of discussion with foreign parliamentarians. And this was a nightmare, because when Western, especially politicians, came to the Soviet Union, each of them was trained in that. Each of them could discuss anything, because they were politicians. That was literally their job. And the Soviet side, of course not. So they had to be prepped. And each branch of the dialogue needed to include quotes from the current party leader, right? So the second quote here, I think, is quite interesting. So, tomorrow is the final meeting with the British parliamentarians. God, how much fuss with them. But for them, this is ordinary political charter. I have to prepare for Ponomarev memos, taking into account all options for a possible discussion, and in such a manner that each had a quote from Gorbachev. And you can see also that, I don't know, on purpose or not, Western parliaments started trolling a little bit the Soviet Union there, increasing the number of these exchanges, perhaps knowing how much effort it requires. The final point that I want to make, this all came into a huge inner kind of catastrophe for the Supreme Soviet during perestroika. Because during perestroika, there was an idealistic attempt to create a perfect version of a simultaneously Supreme Soviet, so that is a socialist parliament and a liberal parliament. So they wanted to create an institution which would be legislative assembly, which would discuss laws, which would be dependent on voters elected through contested elections, and so on, but which would at the same time toward the world receive hundreds of thousands of appeals and petitions, and the system kind of collapsed on itself. So the support rate for the USSR Supreme Soviet, I think, was below 2% in 1990 and 1991, right? Because it was seen as pointless. They didn't have time to listen to petitioners. They didn't have time to attend meetings because they had real jobs. That was this ideal of Soviet parliamentarism, that it's real workers who come to sit there. And of course, when money ran short, it became quite difficult to decide who goes where for these trips. And then there was also quite a lot of fuss about how we should stop, doing these tourist trips, and we just cannot afford that anymore. So I'll stop here. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I really enjoyed your lecture. It was very illuminative, I can say, especially for us from ex-Yugoslavia. I was comparing our situation with your words all the time, for all 45 minutes. I guess the others were doing the same. So we have plenty of time, according to Marcus' words, to discuss everything said in these 45 minutes. So please, the floor is yours. I might start, but I'll give you the word.
I have a question. Thank you very much for the lecture. I also enjoyed it very much. You were emphasizing that all the decisions were accepted unanimously. Was there an occasion when this didn't happen in all the history? Okay, great. And what was the consequence of that? And another question regarding the feedback function. Was this also some kind of persecution function. So perhaps if any letter or petition was too critical, and if there was a real person, organization behind it, did this have some consequences for that person, for example? And did this have some effect on this institution later on if it became public, like, rumors or whatever? So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Should I respond?
Yeah.
Directly? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So concerning the dissensus, apart from that one instance on when the second chamber should stop its meetings until 87, no, not a single instance of dissenting vote on the union level. I don't know about Republican level, maybe, but unlikely, right? On the Supreme, because this was part of the responsibility of the local party members, party leaders who would appoint these deputies. If somebody raised that issue, then heads would be flying later, right? In the case of that very first and last dissensus at the very first meeting, there were no consequences for the person who raised the issue. So he actually became a jurist after that. Yeah, he was a petty party functionary at the time, and he survived the Great Purge. It was 38, so that nothing happened to him. I was surprised actually about that. Actually, the person who defended the official view was persecuted for other reasons, I guess. But yeah, in 87, this is the time before the reform. So when it was still an appointed parliament, when some deputies from the Baltic states started to dissent. So these are the first occasions in 87, and they started to raise issues which were not supposed to be raised. For example, issues related to environmental problems. So between 38 and 87, no any other instance. The second question about petitions. So there is a group of petitions which are still classified. Those are the enemy petitions, the internal enemy petitions, right? So I suppose whenever there was political criticism, immediately repressive measures followed. So I had access only to the petitions which were not anonymous and not criticizing the system itself. They were only about management problem. So they were only about kind of being mistreated by Soviet officials or suffering from their negligence or any other things like that. But that was the most political they would get. But then in the 60s, with the launch of the dissident movement in the Soviet Union, dissidents would use these petitions as an instrument. They would write letters to the Presidium, and then they would pass these letters, making them open letters, pass them to foreign journalists. So Sakharov, for example, did that with a couple of other people. So, of course, I mean, that led to repercussions, but that was also intended effect, right? So that's what they wanted to do to gain some international publicity in this matter. So this genre of writing political statements to the Presidium, yeah, it became an important instrument for dissidents.
Another question. I have one provocative question. I like very much the idea of tracing the functions of the parliament, as you might know. I mean, I think this is the basic idea of what should we study parliaments and all. These aren't only today deliberative, democratically elected bodies, but they do have still today symbolic functions. I like the idea of this descriptive representation very much, the integrative idea, etc., etc. But you know what I think that we should focus on these symbolic functions even before the socialist era and of course after this socialist era. I think this is my working thesis that maybe today this ex-socialist symbolic functions, some of them are even stronger today in today's parliament. The idea of descriptive representation, I mean, it wasn't so common in the 70s and in the 80s in the West. But today, everyone is arguing we should have more women in the parliament. Why should we have more women in the parliament? I do not understand this whole idea. We should have the parliament that is some kind of a descriptive representation. I think it's very dangerous for an idea of deliberative democracy. This is quite obviously a socialist idea of some other kind of parliament. What do you think?
Well, I would respond by comparing the situation in the Soviet Union before and after the liberalization. So before liberalization, the share of women in the Soviet parliament was about 30%, because 30, yeah, because that was done according to an unwritten quota, according to internal party documents. Then after free elections took place, for example, in the Russian Federation, within the USSR still, the share dropped to 5%. But then there were a lot of discussions in the Soviet and later post-Soviet feminist movement about that. And basically, one of the key arguments that they contended against Western feminist view of that was that 30% didn't matter in state socialist contexts. It could be 100%. So what? If you still have to repeat everything that is given to you, if the speech is written to you, doesn't matter. The 5%, on the other hand, means that you have 5% of women who faced, perhaps in post-Soviet context, harsher electoral hurdles, who have real programs, who proved themselves as politicians, and because of that, for their feminist agenda within the Soviet Union, they are more important. Another aspect about kind of this descriptive representation as a whole, part of my argument for the whole 20th century is that it became not just an additional, let's say, an important function added to legislation, like in Western context, but in imperial parliaments and state socialist parliaments, it became one of the main functions. So basically, a parliament is not a place where laws are made. And this partially applies already to the State Duma. So the State Duma did adopt some legislation, so it had some legislative functions, but it was limited in its rights. But the descriptive side of it, not kind of top-down, but bottom-up, was very important, because through getting their caucus, their parliamentary group, we would have basically political communities emerging from cultural communities. So, for example, there was caucus of Muslims in the State Duma, which means that Muslims as a cultural group suddenly became a political subject. And of course, the issue of women's representation was important also for the feminists in the late Russian Empire, precisely for the same reason, to stop being just kind of a social category, but acquire political agency through being represented in the parliament, right? And then, of course, I would say the situation somewhat repeated itself during the perestroika parliamentary transition, because you would also have kind of this bottom-up building of these descriptive categories, not top-down like in state socialist context, but bottom-up, right? So you would organize not on the principle of party ideology, but on the principle of belonging to the same category. Again, for example, having the same religion, right? So again, my point would be that imperial parliaments and state socialist parliaments, this function comes not as an addition to legislation, right? But as the main function, yeah.
I have a question. When you mentioned the competitive nature of the relations between them and Yugoslav-led, at the time, non-aligned movement, how did this competition materialize precisely? Was it more symbolic in the sense of many more hospitals and nurseries were visited, or did it result with more financial aid or even some weapon assistance to certain movements in these countries and so on?
Thank you. Well, I know only a little bit on the topic, which relates to parliaments directly. I would say when it related to parliaments, it was mainly symbolic. But then I suppose from this symbolism, there could be some practical consequences in the non-aligned world. So can the Soviet Union, snatch a few countries from the non-aligned movement into the socialist camp or not? And vice versa, right? Can there be more state socialist countries which are not entirely dependent on the Soviet Union, right? If we take the Yugoslav perspective. But then again, I would say that the resources were very different. The financial resources of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union very often just kind of bought its dependencies, so to say. So, for example, in Ethiopia or Mozambique or Angola, communists nominal communists came to power in exchange for very concrete material things that Yugoslavia could not offer them for development independently, right? So that would be a lot of armaments in the case of Angola, for example. So there would be factory construction in the case of Ethiopia, right? So in that regard, I think in that competition, I guess the symbolic part was more important, also in the sense how far can a post-colonial or broader developmental regime go in its concessions to the Soviet Union to get this funded. And then it turned out that you basically just have to say things. You don't have actually to do things to be considered part of the Soviet informal empire. So that actually gave a lot of points to the Soviet team in the sense that you can say whatever and then just get infrastructure projects in exchange. So in the non-alignment movement, India is perhaps the most interesting case in this regard because, having introduced 5-year plans and some token socialist ideas, they managed to get a lot of funding from the Soviet Union, even remaining as a key power in the non-alignment movement.
Maybe I have a question because you are focusing basically on a very long term continuities and ruptures in a way, and also because you mentioned in the beginning that you are building a lot on the work of political scientists and the ideal type of parliament in a way, and also you had this slide on bourgeois parliament. So I'm wondering about continuities with the pre-revolutionary period and were there any continuities or references to what was earlier? Because when you put this bourgeois parliament, was it only in relation to the West, or was it in relation to what was earlier? And just if you could start a bit.
So this happened. Yeah, thank you. This happened mainly during the early period. So 1930s, when the Supreme Soviet was recently introduced. So it was introduced 36 and first convened 38. And 40s. So when the bourgeois parliaments were criticized, the State Duma was included into them, yes. And there were 2 deputies who were actually former deputies of the State Duma who were part of the Supreme Soviet. They were, of course, both Bolsheviks, but still they were kind of touring between different meetings and saying, yeah, I was in the Duma, it was bad. Just like other bourgeois parliaments. But I would say that there is a very important continuity between the State Duma and the Supreme Soviet. One of the goals of the State Duma, which was attached to it by the ruling elite, was to create an institution which would demonstrate loyalty and nurture this loyalty. So basically, the Supreme Soviet achieved, in a sense, what the Tsarist elite tried to achieve. So institution which would unite behind the leadership. So basically, when Tsar agreed to summon the Duma, that was the idea, that the people will come and support the throne. So that's why they tried to sneak so many peasants in the Duma. So their surprise, of course, was very unpleasant when the peasants came mostly socialist there and were not rallying behind the throne, right? So in a way, the Soviet Union managed to achieve that, of course, symbolically, right? Because as we see in the perestroika time, as soon as the restrictions were dropped, then immediately the support dwindled, even though the perestroika parliament was a majority communist parliament, but was in opposition to the party, right? Leadership, right? Even though most people were communists, because everybody who had political career in mind had to be a communist. Another continuity is related to descriptive representation. So one of the key purposes of the State Duma was to resolve the imperial crisis. The crisis when there was an attempt on behalf of the imperial elites to transition from dynastic sovereignty to national sovereignty, to create, instead of the Romanovs' empire, a Russian empire, which would be led by a small noble elite. This Russian empire would be run but mainly by German Russian nobility. So if you look at the names of Russian nationalists of the Duma period, there are a lot of von there, and Berg and other kind of very typical German nobility names. But in a way, it continued during the revolution. So the attempt to resolve the imperial crisis, so the response to this from different groups which were organized according to categories of difference. Let's say Muslims who acquired political agency were not happy with some German and Russian nobles doing that. Gender, women were not happy with kind of this attempt to create another male-dominated political institution. Workers, peasants, of course, represented mainly by socialist intellectuals, but nonetheless, right? And the idea was during the Russian Revolution to create a super parliament, which would bring all these groups together, representatives of these groups, ideally speaking, representative of worker, of peasant, of Cossack, which would sit together and come out of this crisis without bloodshed. As you know, with the Russian Civil War and 21 million victims, didn't work out in the end. But this was something that the Supreme Soviet tried to emulate. It tried to emulate the resolution of the imperial crisis. So that was one of the Stalin's, I think, manic ideas, that he had to be the person who resolved the imperial crisis. So, for example, Cossacks were there in 1938, even after repressions, decossacization, and so on. And they were there, of course, with only the right to declare their loyalty to Stalin and the party, but they were there. There were different ethnicities, gender, occupational groups. So basically, everyone was there apart from religious groups. But even with religious groups, in 1946, you have a picture of a priest voting. Not in the parliament, of course, itself, but he's voting, so he's there also, right? So in this regard, the goal of the Supreme Soviet was to show through descriptive representation that the imperial crisis was resolved. Perestroika politics showed that it wasn't.
The dialogue tree that you were talking about, the bureaucracy prepared for the MPs' foreign meetings. I think this is not just a bizarre detail, but a very important thing, because it shows us the importance and the professionalism of bureaucracy. This is often the part that we are missing when we are analyzing parliaments, if you ask me, because often I can say, this is at least my impression, that the bureaucracy was often running the whole business. Deputies were often only performing as actors, but the actual parliamentary business was done by the huge bureaucracy. And bureaucracy should be and was also in Yugoslavia in the 1920s and 30s very, very professional and skilled. And even today, I may add, at the European Union level, when something is agreed at the Coreper 2 sessions at the European level, and that had to be discussed between the member states, high state officials get the same material from Slovenian bureaucracy. I did the same. It was not algorithm, but presumed questions, issues raised by the German delegation, Belgian delegation, and possible answers, because you had to follow the main guidelines. Okay, the codes of Unisiantia were missing, but everything else was there. Even today, the logic is still here.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant point. Comparing it to the Soviet situation, I mean, the situation today or during the imperial times, I would say that there were two main differences. First, one is that bureaucracy was internal to the entire institution of parliament, right? So it was not something that that the parliamentarians could influence in any sense. So it was just given to them. So basically, they were given a script which they had to follow exactly. So there was they had no agency at all in this regard. Only, of course, those parliamentarians who simultaneously, because he was writing this speech for Ponomarev, but Ponomarev was his boss too, right? So this is, I think, interesting. In a way, perhaps this is what makes it similar to situations in Western parliaments or contemporary parliaments, right? And the other thing is that this kind of preparation for different lines of discussion now requires some concrete information from the bureaucrats. From the Soviet bureaucrats of the late Brezhnev era, it required propaganda framings. So it was just, let's say, empty discourse, And Chernyav's diary, which is actually published on the National Security Archives website of the US government, right? Chernyav's diary is very interesting in this regard because it provides this glimpse into the inner workings of bureaucracy, which basically produces empty words. And they are aware of that. And I think this is a major part of the Soviet crisis altogether, because none of these branches actually had something concrete. I mean, there could be one concrete point with delegation of American parliamentarians that, you know, we want to have this armament limitation treaty. That's it. Everything else, every other type of discussion would be just empty discourse, right? And then Chernyv also kind of gets this impression that the system after Brezhnev's deterioration of health, I don't remember when exactly that was, but during at least the last 5 years of Brezhnev being in power, the system ran itself on paper, basically. It was just words and words. Okay, KGB did work in a different sphere, but the government and the Central Committee, they were just producing words. And that's it. And that's one of the reasons why it all came into crisis. So he's fearing a crisis of and collapse of the entire system already in the late 70s. So he's saying it's not going to continue like that because we're not doing anything at all. We're just writing and writing and writing. And the writing has no content.
A lesson for today. Any other questions? So I think that's it. Thank you very much. Again, even 1 hour and 15 minutes. Better than the Supreme Soviet. We can grab a beer. We have more than enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.